Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. As South Korea grapples with political turmoil following President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment after a brief declaration of martial law, the country faces growing uncertainty both at home and abroad. In a bid to reassure foreign partners, the Seoul Foreign Ministry has sent diplomatic letters to all overseas missions, affirming that diplomatic efforts will proceed under the acting leadership of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. Also, in an unprecedented move, both the Foreign and Finance Ministries are scheduled to hold a joint press briefing for foreign correspondents on Wednesday to address mounting concerns over the nation's political stability. With South Korea's foreign policy and international relations at a crossroads, experts weigh in on how this crisis could reshape the country's diplomatic priorities, affect key alliances with Japan and China, and impact its long-term global standing. For a deeper discussion on this, we invite Mason Rishi, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us is Han Kim, Assistant Professor at Sogang University GSIS. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Professor Kim. So how could the current political turmoil in South Korea, the impeachment efforts and President Yoon's brief martial law declaration influence the country's foreign policy priorities?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, despite all this current political turmoil, I think that the broad diplomatic policies will remain relatively the same. South Korea will continue to work to strengthen the U.S.-ROK alliance to counter North Korea's nuclear threats, and President Biden recently also spoke with acting President Han Duck-soo to reaffirm his strong commitment to the alliance as well. And Korea will also try to maintain friendly diplomatic relations with other countries such as Japan and China. So President Yoon's impeachment has removed some uncertainties, but in the worst case scenario has been avoided. But of course, there will inevitably be some fallouts due to the impeachment as well. So in the United States, for example, other world leaders are currently working to strengthen their relationships with Trump ahead of his inauguration next year. But Korea is not in a position where it can do that. And this is particularly painful given Trump's preference for top-down diplomacy. In the case of Japan, the 60th anniversary celebration of normalized relations between Korea and Japan is supposed to take place next year, but this will most likely face some disruptions. And in the case of China, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has expressed discomfort with Yoon claiming that Chinese spies were one of the reasons for declaring martial law. So the likelihood of President Xi Jinping personally attending APEC in Gyeongju next year is also diminishing. So right now, it's really important for the leadership vacuum to be resolved quickly so that diplomacy can go back to normal.
Right. Now, what about Professor Rishi? Amid a leadership vacuum, what do you think are the most urgent tasks for the government to address?
So I would start by answering the question differently than you've posed it. And I would say the number one priority for South Korea in terms of its foreign policy is to create or begin to create domestic unity. A strong foreign policy begins with a strong foundation at home. And we've seen how that's simply not the case right now in South Korea. And I'm not simply referring, of course, to the martial law declaration and the sort of self-coup that came after that. This country still remains in many ways profoundly divided. Yes, 70 to 80% of the people wanted to see Yoon impeached. And yes, there was a strong showing of the broader public and reactive democratic resilience, but there are still enormous institutional cleavages here and a lot of polarization in the country. Ideologically and in terms of partisanship. And I really think that that's something that needs to be addressed. And the government, I think, should take steps to do that along, of course, with the National Assembly. In terms of more, I guess, traditional foreign policy issues, the first thing, of course, is to continue to maintain working level and official level normalcy to the extent possible. And even senior level interactions, again, where possible. There's, insofar as there's a presidential leadership vacuum, there's some things that are simply not going to be possible, as Professor Kim just mentioned. I think, and this power vacuum, probably most problematically, is going to prevent South Korea from getting an early influence on Trump in the way that they would have liked to. I think a third issue is alliance management. Obviously, South Korea is going to continue to want to manage and, to the extent possible, advance the alliance with the United States. And the United States is going to be receptive to that, as they've indicated. And that includes, obviously, also working together and continuing to work together on deterring North Korea and watching out for all of the malign behavior that North Korea is up to. Fourth, I think, preparing for Trump to the extent possible. So, having your plans in place for how you would respond to, tariffs and export controls and other things that Trump is quite interested in. And then lastly, I think continuing to work with Japan, again, where possible, although there again, I think that there's going to be some significant uncertainty there compared to what we would have expected under Yoon.
Right, so there would be influences in many aspects. But let's first delve into the case of Japan. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba says that the importance of the Seoul-Tokyo alliance will remain unchanged despite the political turmoil in South Korea. But there are concerns that rising domestic opposition against Yoon, who made efforts to improve ties with Japan, could lead to a reversal of this. Professor Kim, what are your thoughts on this?
Right. So, one of President Yoon's biggest diplomatic achievements was improving relations with Japan. This has led to stronger trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. But now this framework is starting to shake. In the United States, Trump has been elected, and he tends to downplay relations with U.S. allies. In Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba's domestic political standing isn't very solid. In fact, it's been shaky from the very beginning. And in Korea, Yoon's conciliatory gestures towards Japan have been criticized for quite some time domestically, and it has been called submissive diplomacy even before his impeachment. So it's going to get even harder, to expect the same level of friendly policies towards Japan under the acting president. In addition to this, and Professor Macy also kind of mentioned this, there's a change in power. If there's a change in power in the next presidential election, historical issues between South Korea and Japan might resurface again, which could lead to increasing tensions. But that being said, I don't think we can completely rule out the possibility that South Korea and Japan, will work together, because it is very likely that the two countries will cooperate and respond, especially if Trump starts making excessive demands towards both countries once he takes office.
Right, and now on the security issue, Japan's Asahi Shimbun newspaper warns that the impeachment motion against Yoon could destabilize the crucial U.S., South Korea, and Japan trilateral security framework. Professor Rishi, how could South Korea's political situation influence its relationship with Japan, particularly in terms of regional security and trade dynamics?
Sure. So again, I'm completely on board with what Professor Kim just said in terms of the presidential vacuum and how that here plays out in Japan. As we know, Ishiba has canceled a planned visit for here because to some degree he doesn't have a suitable counterpart. Plus, I think he probably wants to give South Korea some time to get its house in order, so to speak, politically. He is weak at home himself, so even within Japan, he faces some criticism for his party's continued outreach to South Korea. So I think that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, again, Professor Kim mentioned earlier, and I think this is absolutely correct, is that Yoon had a singular determination to rebuild relations with Japan, both bilaterally and, of course, even more so in a trilateral context with the United States. For all of the terrible things that he did, or that we think that he did, at least, I actually think that this was a good idea, and he displayed a remarkable political courage, arguably political foolishness, depending on if you looked at how popular this was. In his single-minded effort to do that and to not be deterred by what popular opinion might have held about this outreach to Tokyo. That's going to be missing, even if the next president is a conservative, that determination probably won't be there as much. It won't be there under Han Duck-soo, who can't make the types of grand gestures and risky political moves that a president can, simply because he doesn't have the domestic legitimacy to do so. So I think that's another thing that's important. And then the last few things I would say is, obviously, one of the things that has pushed thus, Tokyo-Seoul relations forward has been the United States under Biden, who have made this really a priority. And now with Trump coming in, it's unclear to what extent they're going to push this forward, but probably not as much as Biden has. So that aspect we'll be missing as well. And then, of course, looking over the horizon, we might end up within the next 6 months or so with a President Lee Jae-myung. And the Democratic Party here, and especially Lee Jae-myung, are simply antithetical to Japan in a lot of ways. In fact, the first articles of impeachment that they drafted actually included language in there about the problems of Yoon's diplomatic outreach to Japan. If that type of language can make it into the articles of impeachment, they were stripped out in the second version, but if they can make it into that first articles of impeachment, that clearly indicates where the DP and Lee Jae-myung is on this. And so if he becomes president, then I think that you're clearly looking at a very, very rocky relationship between Tokyo and Seoul.
Right. Then could you elaborate more on, the specific challenges and opportunities that the two countries could face under the incoming Trump administration?
Sure. So as I said, again, not having Yoon's determination to push this forward is already a loss in terms of the relationship with Tokyo. Even if you were to have a conservative, with full presidential legitimacy come into play, Yoon was more than willing to simply overlook problems that happened in terms of historical anniversaries, right? Which typically bring up all kinds of sensitive historical issues in South Korea, and he was willing to essentially take the political hit for that. Not even a conservative another conservative is going to do that, much less the DP. In addition to that, simply domestic politics, right? The Democratic Party here uses Japan as a whipping boy for their own political purposes here, and so again, that's going to be something that's going to change and become more prevalent, because Yoon, at the very least, was willing to let the DP do that and largely factor that into his equation in terms of political popularity. In terms of specific issues that Tokyo and Seoul might face, we don't know what's going to happen with North Korea in 2025. They've been quite calm and largely willing to continue to extract benefits from their new alliance with Moscow, but that might slowly ramp down if and when, especially the Ukraine war begins to grind to a halt, as Trump has indicated that he's going to try to force. And that means that North Korea is going to start probably turning his attention back towards malign behavior here in the region. And the Seoul-Tokyo-U.S. trilateral relationship has focused on intelligence sharing, missile defense, other defense and deterrence coordination, and that part might not be as strong, both under Han Duck-soo and potentially, of course, under Lee Jae-myung. And then, of course, trade issues, as Professor Kim just mentioned. Ideally, if the Trump administration were to put excessive pressure on Seoul and Tokyo in the realm of trade and export controls and other areas like that, you would ideally like to have Seoul and Tokyo be on the same page, and it's less clear that that would be the case either under a caretaker government like Han Duck-soo or certainly under a government with under Lee Jae-myung.
Right. Now let's also move on to the topic of China. President Yoon has defended his brief declaration of martial law, saying it was necessary because opposition parties blocked changes to anti-espionage laws. He then pointed to two incidents where Chinese nationals filmed South Korea's military sites and the intelligence agency, which has angered China. Professor Kim, how do you assess the impact of such statements by Yoon on international relations?
And so usually, even if such things actually happen, they're typically handled very quietly and rather than being discussed so publicly. So President Yoon's statement was quite unusual, and China has officially expressed its discontent and displeasure regarding this. But at the same time, it's possible that the impact of this statement will be relatively limited. China does, to a certain extent, value its friendly relationship with South Korea and wants to expand cooperation. Also, Lee Jae-myung, holds relatively friendly friendlier views towards China, more so than Japan, as Professor Richie mentioned also. And, right now, Lee Jae-myung is currently the front runner of the next presidency. And so it's very unlikely that China will keep criticizing the statement from an already impeached president. But instead, it's very likely that China will continue to watch Korea's domestic politics very closely and carefully while looking for opportunities to improve relations with Korea.
Right, especially with Trump administration coming in. Now, the impeachment has delayed key diplomatic appointments, including the planned departure of Ambassador Chung Jae-ho and the anticipated appointment of Kim Dae-gi as a new ambassador to China. With Yoon's duties suspended as of now, these appointments are in jeopardy, raising concerns about the gap in diplomatic communication between the two countries. Now, excuse me. So what are your thoughts on this, Professor Kim?
Yeah, I think once acting President Han Duck-soo actually starts his duties, the replacement of the Chinese ambassador will proceed relatively smoothly. Given that Kim Dae-gi was one of President Yoon's closest aides, there's been a bit of uncertainty about whether or not he really will be sent as the ambassador to China. But still, Kim Dae-gi has already received an agreement from China. And if the acting president doesn't appoint him as ambassador after he has already received this agreement, it could be seen as a diplomatic discourtesy. So it's true that there has been some temporary disruptions in diplomatic communications through ambassadors, but at the working level, communications are still continuing without significant problems. Of course, we might really feel the impact of the impeachment if major issues come up that require discussions at the leadership level. But as long as there aren't such extreme issues, I think we can rely on the diplomats to avoid significant problems, at least as of now.
Right. And Professor Richie, how might the current political instability affect South Korea's foreign trade policy with China, its major economic partner?
Yeah, there are a number of ways, of course, but just to sort of pick on one or two, if U.S. Pressure on China has knock-on effects on South Korea, then you would want, legitimate presidential leadership at the highest level to be able to try to intervene for South Korea's economic interests. And so just to give you one example, if the Trump administration, for instance, were to put tariffs on Chinese products the way that he has indicated that he would, then that could have knock-on effects on South Korea's industries who export intermediary goods to China for final value added before they are shipped off to other places, including to the United States. And so, if that's a blanket set of tariffs, that would, require one set of responses from South Korea. If it's, more targeted on certain sets of industries, then obviously, South Korea would want to the extent possible, negotiate a deal with the Trump administration where it would, be relatively favorably treated in this type of situation. You could also imagine coming the other direction. That there could be, rules and regulations put in place on the amount of Chinese intermediary goods that would end up in South Korean finished products that would be sent to the United States, and that those might therefore come under a higher tariff than they would otherwise. And that's just talking about tariffs. That's not talking about export controls and all of the other issues that are involved. So. Really I think the primary place where we're expecting to see friction between the U.S. and China is going to be in the economic sphere, and that will probably have some knock-on effects on South Korea. And having a president who has President Trump's ear would clearly be an advantage, and that's not going to be Han Duck-soo.
Right. So let's circle back our discussion to Trump and the Seoul-U.S. alliance. Trump, when President Park Geun-hye got impeached, hesitated to engage in discussions with an acting president. And 8 years on, with another impeachment process ongoing in South Korea, he's expected to deal with South Korea's Prime Minister as he takes office in January. Professor Rishi, how do you think the situation would affect Seoul-Washington ties moving forward?
Yeah, so I expect that South Korea will be somewhat deprioritized, and Yeah, I actually think that South Korea was probably not going to be enormously important in the White House in the first months anyway. I think that the Trump administration is going to be focused a lot on domestic issues, on Trump's quixotic attempt to try to root out what he calls the deep state. The changes through this government efficiency quango that they seem to set up with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Trump's revenge tour, the lawfare that goes along with that, confirmation, all of these things, they're going to eat up a lot of the White House's time. And I think that was going to be the case anyway. So, in some sense, South Korea is likely to be even more deprioritized than it probably would have been anyway. I think that the downside is that, South Korea may miss some opportunities to influence Trump in an early phase, even, of course, before his inauguration and, of course, in the first months afterwards. It may have some trouble defending its interests if the Trump administration comes out of the gate with some policies and some ideas that are negative for South Korea. Not having a president who can get on the phone and get in touch with someone in the Oval Office right away probably makes it a little bit more difficult for South Korea to advance its interests. We know, for instance, that Trump talked about shipbuilding. To what extent is the cooperation on shipbuilding between the U.S. and South Korea perhaps going to come under threat because there's not a president here to push that forward? I'm actually not an expert on that, so I can't tell you, but that might be a missed opportunity. It may also, in some cases, perhaps allow South Korea to be a little bit off the radar. And depending on how aggressive the Trump administration comes out swinging in terms of trying to stick it to its allies and partners and adversaries in terms of trade deficits and things like that, maybe South Korea won't be first up in line to receive the stick. So there could be possibly some upside, but I think the inability to influence Trump, or the reduced ability to influence Trump in the first months, is probably going to be the biggest problem.
Right, especially since it's not clear whether South Korea's new leadership would have different or same directions with the current ones. Now, given the ongoing volatility and the time needed for the impeachment process, what kind of strategic adjustments could South Korea make to maintain stability in its relationships with these regional powers, Professor Kim?
Well, first off, I do completely agree with Professor Ritchie in the sense that, Korea is not going to be a main priority here, especially because the U.S. is going to be focused a lot more on domestic politics. And so in many ways, the U.S.-ROC alliance is going to be facing many challenges as it has in the past. But at the same time, the U.S.-ROC alliance has remained so strong for the last 70 years. So I think that it will still continue to remain strong, despite a lot of these challenges that it has experienced. But, there is a possibility that in the context with the U.S.-ROC alliance, Trump will be taking much more of a transactional approach, like demanding higher defense cost sharing from South Korea and whatnot. In terms of working with regional powers, depending on which administration comes into power next, there's a lot of volatility here. So it's very difficult to say for sure. But in terms of, as of right now, South Korea is still trying to maintain friendly diplomatic relations with a lot of the countries within the neighboring countries, including Japan and including China.
Right. So we'll have to continue our efforts and hope the situation settles down as soon as possible. Now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Many thanks to Professor Rishi and Professor Kim for your insights tonight. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Now, that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.